Listen. Somewhere, far beyond the edges of sleep, it is raining over Gotham City. Not a storm, not thunder, just a soft, steady rain. The kind that taps gently against old windows and slides down brick that has stood for over 100 years. It collects in the gutters along Park Row. It beads on the shoulders of stone gargoyles who have watched this city since before anyone alive can remember. It falls without hurry, the way all good rain does, as if it too is in no rush to be anywhere else tonight. Above the rooftops, the clouds hang low and grey, heavy with the kind of quiet that only settles over a city late at night. And if you look closely, just past the water towers, just beyond the fire escapes, you might see it. A single beam of light cutting up into the fog. Yellow, steady, shaped like a bat. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It simply glows there, patiently, the way an old lamp glows in the window of a house where someone is waiting for you to come home. Tonight, we're not chasing that light. We're not racing across rooftops or leaping between fire escapes. Tonight, we're going to slow down. We're going to let Gotham breathe around us the way it always has, whether anyone was watching or not. Far outside the city, past the winding roads and the old iron gates, sits a manor, Wayne Manor. Its windows are dark, save for one, low and golden, flickering like candlelight, though it's only a lamp. Inside, a grandfather clock ticks in the hallway, unbothered by time, the way it has ticked for generations of Waynes before this one. And somewhere beneath that manor, beneath the library, beneath the study, beneath the floor itself, there is a cave. You can almost hear it if you listen closely enough. Water, falling somewhere in the dark, echoing off stone that has never seen sunlight. A soft hum, low and mechanical, from a great computer whose screens glow like blue moonlight against the cave walls. And somewhere in the shadows, hanging quietly, wings folded, hundreds of real bats sleep the way we are about to. This is the Bat Cave. This is where our story begins tonight. Not with an explosion, not with a chase, but with silence. With an old chair, a stack of yellowed case files, a cup of tea going cold on the edge of a desk, and a man who has spent his entire life turning grief into purpose. Tonight, we are going to open that archive together. Slowly, gently. 500 small pieces of Batman's world. His history, his family, his city, his enemies, his heart. Laid out like old photographs on a table, one leading softly into the next. There's no need to remember any of it. There's no test at the end of this. Just let the words wash over you the way the rain washes over Gotham's rooftops. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your thoughts slow down. Somewhere above us, the bat signal is still glowing in the clouds. And somewhere below us, in a cave carved from limestone and memory, an old story is about to be told again. Let's begin. Every legend starts somewhere small. Batman's began not in Gotham, but in a cramped apartment in New York City, in the spring of 1939, where a young artist named Bob Kane sat at his drawing table trying to invent something the world hadn't quite seen before. Kane had already tasted a little success in comics, but nothing like what was coming. National Publications, the company that would one day become DC Comics, had just watched a caped strongman named Superman turn their entire industry upside down. Sales were extraordinary. Readers wanted more heroes who could fly, who could lift cars over their heads, who could stop bullets with their bare chests. Kane wanted to give them something different, something that couldn't fly, something that bled. He sketched a figure in red tights with a small domino mask and two stiff bat-like wings jutting from his back, almost like a costume from a school play. It was interesting. It was not yet Batman. It was here that a quiet, brilliant writer named Bill Finger entered the story, a man whose name for decades the world barely knew. Finger looked at Kane's sketch and began asking the kind of questions that only a true storyteller asks. What if the wings became a cape so they could flow and ripple like something alive? What if the mask covered more of the face, hiding the eyes in shadow so no one could read them? What if the bright red costume became deep grey and black, colours that could disappear into the dark instead of standing out against it? Finger suggested gloves. He suggested the pointed cowl. He suggested the utility belt. He gave the character a first name and a last name that sounded aristocratic, yet plain enough to hide in public. Bruce, after a Scottish king who never gave up, and Wayne, borrowed from a Revolutionary War general. Bill Finger didn't just refine Batman's appearance, he built his soul. He wrote the very first origin story, a boy in an alley, 2 gunshots, 2 falling bodies, and a candle-lit vow made beside a window. For over 70 years, that origin barely changed, because Finger got it right the first time. Yet for most of his life, Finger's name did not appear on a single page of Batman comics. Bob Kane had secured a contract early on that gave him sole credit, no matter how much of the character was built by other hands. Finger died in 1974, largely unrecognized, his name absent from the character he helped create. It wasn't until decades later, after years of advocacy by historians, fans, and Finger's own family, that DC Comics finally added his name beside Kane's on new publications and on-screen credits. Today, when you watch a Batman film and see the words "Batman created by Bob Kane with Bill Finger," you are watching one of comics' longest overdue corrections finally being made right. It's a strange thing to think about late at night, that one of the most famous heroes in the world was quietly shaped by a man whose name almost vanished from history entirely. Somewhere in that thought is a very Batman kind of lesson, that the quiet work, done without credit, is often the work that matters most. Batman first appeared in Detective Comics issue 27, cover dated May 1939. The cover itself has become one of the most valuable and recognizable images in comic history. Batman swinging by a rope with a criminal caught in his other arm, silhouetted against a purple rooftop night. That single issue, in near perfect condition, has sold at auction for well over $1 million. A 10-cent comic, printed quickly and cheaply on rough newsprint, never meant to last, is now treated like a piece of fine art locked behind reinforced glass. The story inside was called The Case of the Chemical Syndicate. It ran only 6 pages. In it, Batman was darker and far more ruthless than the character most of us grew up with, willing to let criminals fall to their deaths, willing to break bones without hesitation. There was no code against killing yet. That version of Batman would slowly soften over the following years, guided gently by editorial decisions and Bill Finger's expanding sense of who this character truly was. The name Batman was originally written with a hyphen, a small detail lost over the decades. Early stories referred to him as the Batman, almost like a nickname whispered nervously by criminals rather than an official title. Kane and Finger drew inspiration from several places at once. The 1926 film The Bat and its 1930 follow-up, The Bat Whispers, gave them the shadowy silhouette of a criminal in bat-shaped disguise, throwing a bat-shaped light onto walls to frighten victims. The pulp hero known as the Shadow, who stalked criminals through fog-drenched city streets using only his wits and a pair of pistols, gave them tone, atmosphere, and the idea of a hero who was as frightening to criminals as the criminals were to the innocent. And the swashbuckling myth of Zorro, a wealthy, seemingly idle nobleman by day, a masked avenger by night, gave them the entire secret identity structure that Batman still uses today. Even the bat itself came from a story Bob Kane told about Leonardo da Vinci's ornithopter sketches, though historians now believe Kane exaggerated much of his own role in these origin stories over the years. What we know for certain is simpler and, in some ways, more beautiful. Two men needed a symbol that felt like fear itself, something that could stalk the same shadows criminals hid in. And they reached for one of the only animals humans have feared instinctively since before recorded history. Gotham City did not exist yet in that very first story. Early tales were vaguely set in New York, the same city where Batman was born on paper. It took a little time before editors decided the character needed his own city entirely, someplace darker, older, more gothic than the real world could offer. Writer Bill Finger has often been credited with naming the city Gotham, reportedly finding it in a phone book, drawn to how the name sounded old, heavy, almost medieval, like a place time had forgotten to modernize. Gotham quickly became more than a backdrop. It became a character in its own right, a city of extremes, where enormous wealth stood only blocks away from crushing poverty, where cathedral spires rose beside crumbling tenements, where fog rolled in from the harbor and never seemed to fully leave. In these earliest years, Batman's world had none of the gadgets we now consider essential. No Batmobile yet, no standardized Batcave. Batman simply drove a red car, dressed himself, and worked mostly alone, more detective than the armored tactician he would later become. His methods were closer to old pulp fiction crime fighters than the meticulous strategist of later decades. Still, something about him resonated immediately. Readers wrote in. Sales climbed. Within a year, Batman had earned his own solo title, and a mythology began quietly assembling itself, one issue at a time. A young ward named Robin joining him in 1940, a rogues gallery beginning to take shape, and, slowly, carefully, the softening of a hero who had once let men fall to their deaths into one who would come to define an entire code of honor around never killing again. It's worth pausing here, in the quiet, to appreciate just how strange and lucky this all was. Two young men, working under deadline pressure for a comic industry nobody expected to last, created something that outlived every trend around it, outlived the pulp magazines that inspired it, outlived the golden age that birthed it, and kept growing long after both of its creators had passed away. Batman's earliest stories were published during what historians now call the Golden Age of comics, a period roughly spanning the late 1930s through the 1940s. This was an era of experimentation when superhero comics were still figuring out their own rules. Batman during this time occasionally used guns, something that would become unthinkable in later decades. He drove that early red automobile before the Batmobile as we know it debuted. His science was looser, his rogues gallery smaller, his moral code still being written one issue at a time by writers feeling their way through the dark. By 1940, the character had grown popular enough to warrant expansion. Robin, the Boy Wonder, was introduced not just as a sidekick, but as a storytelling device, a way to give young readers someone their own age to project themselves onto, and a way to let Batman speak his internal thoughts aloud to another character instead of narrating silently to himself. That same year brought two villains who remain central to Batman's world even now, the Joker and Catwoman, both appearing within the same handful of issues, each destined to become far more complicated and enduring than anyone likely predicted at the time. It's a strange thought to sit with as the rain falls outside, that in one single year, in a handful of cheaply printed pages, an entire mythology quietly clicked into place. A hero, a city, a sidekick, two of the greatest villains ever created, all arriving together, almost by accident, the way so many great things in history seem to. We'll return to those villains later tonight, deep in their own chapter of this story. For now, let's step back from the ink and the panels and walk instead into the quieter, more human side of this legend, into the childhood of the boy who would become Batman, long before the cowl, long before the cave, back when he was simply a child named Bruce, walking home from a movie theater with his parents on an ordinary, rainy Gotham night. Before there was a Batman, there was simply a boy. Bruce Wayne was born into extraordinary privilege, heir to one of Gotham's oldest and wealthiest families, a bloodline stretching back generations tied to shipping fortunes, real estate, and eventually to Wayne Enterprises itself. But wealth, in Bruce's story, was never the point. It was simply the stage on which something far more painful would unfold. His father, Dr. Thomas Wayne, was a surgeon, brilliant, respected, deeply committed to Gotham's welfare in a way that went beyond charity galas and donations. In many tellings, Thomas Wayne personally treated patients who couldn't afford care, walked the poorer districts of the city himself, and believed, quietly and firmly, that Gotham could be healed rather than simply managed. His mother, Martha Wayne, came from the Kane family, a small, quiet nod from the comics creators, sharing a surname with Bob Kane himself. Martha was often portrayed as gentle but strong, deeply devoted to her son, someone who filled Wayne Manor with warmth despite its enormous, echoing halls. On the night that would end everything, the Wayne family had gone to see a film, in many versions an old adventure movie called The Mark of Zorro, a small but poetic detail, since Zorro was one of Batman's own creative ancestors. Walking home through a neighborhood then known simply as Park Row, they were stopped by a desperate, armed man named Joe Chill. He wanted Martha's pearl necklace. Some accounts suggest he panicked. Others suggest he'd already committed to violence before he ever raised the gun. Either way, 2 shots rang out in the rain, and by the time they faded, Bruce Wayne was an orphan, kneeling on wet pavement between his parents, staring at broken pearls scattered across the ground like tiny, white stars that had fallen out of the sky. That alley would later be named, both in story and by fans, Crime Alley, a place Bruce would return to again and again throughout his life, sometimes to lay flowers, sometimes simply to stand in silence. In some retellings, he visits every single year on the anniversary, alone, unable to fully explain why he needs to keep going back to the one place in Gotham that broke him beyond repair. It's worth sitting with this a moment. Batman's entire mythology, the cowl, the cave, the code, traces back not to some grand cosmic event, not to radiation or magic rings or alien worlds, but to something devastatingly ordinary. A robbery, a gun, a child left alone on wet concrete. It's part of why the character has endured for over 80 years, because his origin isn't fantastical at all. It's the most human tragedy imaginable, dressed later in a cape. A young doctor named Leslie Tompkins is often the one who arrives at the scene that night, kneeling beside the child, offering the only comfort available in that moment: presence and quiet, and a promise that he wouldn't be left there alone. In many versions of the story, Leslie Tompkins goes on to become one of the most important figures in Bruce's early life, later running a free clinic in the very neighborhood where his parents died, embodying the kind of quiet, unglamorous heroism that doesn't require a cape at all. Alfred Pennyworth, the Wayne family's butler, became something closer to a father in the years that followed, not replacing Thomas Wayne, but simply refusing to let the boy disappear into his own grief. Alfred managed the estate, managed Bruce's education, and quietly managed a household that easily could have collapsed under the weight of what had happened. It's said that on the night of the murders, young Bruce made a vow at his parents' bedside, or, in other versions, kneeling by candlelight in his room, swearing that he would spend his life warring on all criminals, that Gotham's alleys would never claim another child's parents the way they claimed his own. That single moment, a whispered vow in candlelight, is one of the most quoted, most illustrated scenes in all of comics. It appears in nearly every origin retelling, sometimes altered slightly, but always emotionally identical. A boy, a candle, a promise he could not possibly have understood the size of yet. What followed was not an immediate transformation into Batman, but rather years, sometimes over a decade, depending on the version, of relentless preparation. Bruce traveled the world, often described visiting dozens of countries, studying under masters of martial arts in places like Japan, China, and the Himalayas. He trained his body to endure pain most people would never willingly experience. He studied criminology, chemistry, forensics, and psychology, sometimes formally, sometimes through informal apprenticeships with detectives, scientists, and even, in some tellings, with skilled criminals themselves, learning how thieves think in order to predict how thieves would act. He learned to disguise his voice. He learned to pick locks blindfolded. He studied the exact pressure points needed to disable an opponent without permanently harming them, an early physical seed of the moral code that would define him for the rest of his life. In many versions, Bruce even sought training from a mysterious, often morally complicated mentor named Henri Ducard, years before Ra's al Ghul was ever formally introduced as a villain. This idea that Bruce's earliest teacher in the art of fear and combat might have had troubling motives of his own has been reused and reimagined many times across comics and film, most famously in Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins. By the time Bruce Wayne returned to Gotham as an adult, he was no longer simply the orphaned boy from Crime Alley. He had become something else entirely, a man fluent in a dozen disciplines, capable of blending into any social circle, from Gotham's elite dinner parties to its criminal underworld, and yet still, underneath it all, carrying that same small, wounded child who once knelt beside two bodies in the rain. His first attempt at fighting crime, in several tellings, was clumsy and nearly disastrous. Dressed in ordinary dark clothing, relying only on his training, he was almost caught, almost killed, and forced to retreat, wounded both physically and in his confidence. Sitting afterward in his study, nursing his injuries, he is said to have wondered aloud what symbol might strike enough fear into criminals that they would finally understand fear the way he once had. And then, as the story goes, a bat crashed through the window of Wayne Manor, startled in from the night, circling once through the study before finding its way back out into the dark. Bruce looked at it and understood, all at once, exactly what he needed to become. Criminals, he reasoned, are a superstitious, cowardly lot. If he was going to strike terror into their hearts, he needed a symbol that wasn't heroic in the traditional sense. Not a bright color, not an eagle, not a lion. Something that lived in darkness. Something that already frightened people instinctively, long before he ever put on the costume. A bat. And so, quietly, in the years that followed, Bruce Wayne began building the two identities that would define the rest of his life. The billionaire philanthropist who attended galas, funded hospitals, and played the role of a bored, disinterested socialite in public, and the figure who moved through Gotham's rooftops after dark, watching, waiting, and slowly becoming a legend the underworld would soon whisper about in fear. Both identities, in their own way, were masks, and only a handful of people in his life would ever come to know which one was real. It's easy, lying here in the quiet, to think of Batman only as gadgets and shadows and rooftop chases. But underneath every single fact we're about to explore tonight, every villain, every vehicle, every case file, there's still that same small boy kneeling in the rain on Crime Alley, still trying, in his own complicated way, to make sure no one else ever has to feel what he felt that night. Let's follow him now, deeper underground, into the quiet stone chamber where all of it truly begins. The Batcave. Beneath Wayne Manor, hidden below a study lined with old books and a grandfather clock that hides more than time, lies a cavern carved slowly over thousands of years by an underground river that has long since dried into a quiet trickle. This is the Batcave. Part fortress, part laboratory, part museum, part home. In most tellings, the cave was already there long before Bruce Wayne ever needed it. Some stories suggest it was used generations earlier during the Underground Railroad, offering shelter to those escaping slavery, a detail that quietly ties the Wayne family's legacy of secrecy and protection back further than Bruce's own lifetime. Other versions suggest Thomas Wayne himself may have known about the cave, perhaps even explored it as a boy, long before his son would ever fill it with computers and crime-fighting equipment. The most famous entrance to the cave lies behind a swinging grandfather clock in the manor's study, its hands permanently set to the exact time. In many versions, the Thomas and Martha Wayne were killed. It's a small, quiet detail, easy to miss, but deeply intentional. Every time Bruce reaches for that clock, he's reminded, just for a moment, of exactly why he's walking downstairs at all. Inside the cave, 3 particular objects have become almost as iconic as Batman himself. The first is a giant standing penny, roughly the size of a small car, usually explained as a trophy from a case involving a villain obsessed with oversized coin-themed crimes. It sits quietly in the corner of the cave, slightly absurd next to the high-tech equipment surrounding it, a strange little reminder that Batman's world has always had room for the theatrical alongside the tragic. The second is a full-sized, robotic Tyrannosaurus Rex, frozen mid-roar. Its origin varies from story to story, sometimes a trophy from a bizarre island adventure, sometimes a relic from a case involving genetically altered creatures. Whatever the explanation, it remains one of the strangest and most beloved details in the entire Batman mythos, a dinosaur standing guard in a cave beneath a billionaire's mansion. The third is a giant Joker playing card, mounted like a trophy, usually representing a particularly personal victory or a particularly painful memory tied to Batman's most dangerous enemy. Unlike the penny or the dinosaur, this trophy tends to carry a heavier, more solemn weight,
whenever it's shown on screen or on the page. A reminder that not every victory in Batman's life comes without scars. The Batcave itself typically houses several key areas. A medical bay, stocked for emergency surgery, since Bruce cannot simply visit a hospital without revealing secret injuries. An armory, holding decades of collected weapons, suits, and trophies from defeated enemies. A massive supercomputer, often simply called the Batcomputer, capable of hacking, analyzing, and cross-referencing more information than most national intelligence agencies. And a vast, quiet library of case files, some going back generations, documenting every criminal Batman has ever studied. There is something deeply peaceful, in a strange way, about imagining that space at night. The waterfall trickling softly in the dark, the hum of machines standing in for silence, and one lone chair where a tired man sits reviewing case files long after the rest of Gotham has gone to sleep. From this cave comes nearly every tool Batman uses in the field, beginning with perhaps his most iconic piece of equipment, the utility belt. The utility belt has evolved considerably since its earliest, simpler appearances in the Golden Age. In modern comics and films, it typically contains specialized compartments for batarangs, smoke pellets, grappling hooks, tracking devices, lockpicks, small explosives, first aid supplies, and often a miniaturized toolkit capable of disabling security systems in seconds. Some versions even include a compact glass cutter, fingerprint lifting kits, or tiny cameras. Every item chosen specifically for the situation Batman anticipated needing it in, since very little about his preparation is ever left to chance. The batarang, one of Batman's signature weapons, first appeared in the early 1940s, originally little more than a simple metal throwing weapon shaped like a bat. Over the decades, it's evolved into everything from simple flat blades to retractable boomerang-style weapons, some capable of returning to Batman's hand after a throw, others equipped with explosives, tracking chips, or grappling functions. Despite the variety, its purpose has remained constant: a quiet, precise weapon meant to disarm rather than kill. The grapple gun, meanwhile, has become almost as symbolic of Batman as the cape itself. A compact device capable of firing a hook and cable with enough force to support his full body weight, allowing him to swing effortlessly between rooftops or scale buildings in seconds. While early comics simply had Batman use a rope and hook thrown by hand, later decades introduced more mechanical, motorized versions, eventually becoming the smooth, near-silent grapple technology seen in most modern adaptations. Then, of course, there's the Batmobile, arguably the most famous vehicle in fiction. Its earliest appearance in the comics was, quite simply, a red convertible, no different from any wealthy man's car of that era. It wasn't until later issues that it evolved into the dark, bat-themed vehicle fans recognize today, complete with a stylized front grille designed to look like a bat's face. Over the decades, the Batmobile has taken wildly different forms depending on the era and medium. A sleek, finned car in the 1960s television series painted a surprisingly bright color for television cameras of the time. A gothic, cannon-equipped tank-like vehicle in Tim Burton's films, and an armored, six-wheeled military vehicle called the Tumbler in Christopher Nolan's trilogy, designed less like a car and more like a machine built to survive a war. No matter its shape, the Batmobile has always represented the same idea: Batman bringing the full weight of his resources and intellect into a single, terrifying, elegant machine, capable of chasing down threats no ordinary vehicle could ever survive. Alongside the Batmobile came other vehicles over the decades: the Batwing, a specialized aircraft capable of both stealth reconnaissance and combat support, first appearing prominently in Tim Burton's 1989 film before becoming a comic mainstay. The Batboat, used for the city's extensive waterways and harbor districts, and even, in some stories, a customized motorcycle called the Batpod, first introduced in The Dark Knight, small and agile enough to weave through Gotham's crowded streets when the Batmobile itself proved too large. And above it all, quite literally, sits the Bat Signal, a modified searchlight installed on the roof of Gotham City Police headquarters, fitted with a bat-shaped emblem that projects onto the low-hanging clouds above the city. First introduced in the comics in the early 1940s, the signal represents something quietly profound. Not a way for Batman to be found by criminals, but a way for the city's own police force, led by Commissioner Gordon, to formally request his help when ordinary methods have run out of options. It's a strange kind of trust, if you think about it. A police commissioner sworn to uphold the law, choosing to shine a light into the sky, asking a vigilante for help. That quiet partnership between Gordon and Batman, built slowly over years of mutual respect, has become just as central to the mythology as any gadget in the cave. Batman's armor and costume, much like his vehicles, have changed considerably depending on the decade and the storyteller. Early Golden Age Batman wore a costume with almost no protective properties at all, closer to a Halloween disguise than functional armor. By the late 1980s and 1990s, in comics and especially in film, the suit evolved into a genuine, armored piece of equipment, capable of stopping small-caliber bullets and resisting bladed weapons. Christopher Nolan's films famously introduced a more militarized version of the suit, complete with a designed vulnerability at the neck, simply so Bruce could physically turn his head. A small, oddly humanizing engineering flaw hidden inside an otherwise terrifying suit of urban armor. Beyond weapons and vehicles, Batman's true arsenal has always relied heavily on detective equipment. Portable forensic kits capable of analyzing fingerprints, fibers, and chemical residue on the spot. Specialized lenses and goggles offering night vision, thermal imaging, and even detection of recently disturbed dust or footprints. And a range of tracking devices small enough to be planted on a suspect's clothing without them ever noticing. All of it, the belt, the batarangs, the vehicles, the signal glowing above the city, exists for one simple reason. Batman has no superpowers, no flight, no super strength, no ability to survive falls or bullets on his own. Every single tool in that cave exists to compensate for that absence, transforming a single determined man into something the underworld eventually begins to fear, as though he were something more than human. Which brings us, quite naturally, to the part of Batman that no gadget can replace: his mind. Let's move now from the cave's quiet machinery into something far more fascinating: the way Batman actually thinks. If you strip away every gadget, every vehicle, every piece of armor in that cave, you're left with the one tool Batman has always relied on more than any other: his intellect. In nearly every version of the character, Batman is described, quite simply, as one of the greatest detectives in the world. Not merely skilled, among the very best, frequently placed alongside legendary fictional investigators when writers imagine crossovers or comparisons. It's part of why his very first comic title was literally called Detective Comics, a name the publishing company itself would eventually take as its own. Batman's investigative method typically blends multiple disciplines at once: forensic science, criminal psychology, chemistry, and simple, patient observation. He is often shown analyzing a crime scene the way most people read a familiar book, noticing tiny details that seem meaningless individually but form a complete picture once combined. A slight scuff on a shoe, an unusual chemical smell lingering in a room, the specific brand of cigarette left in an ashtray. Each detail on its own is nothing. Together, they become an answer. This obsessive attention to detail extends into his understanding of the human mind. Batman has been shown, across countless stories, deeply studying criminal psychology, not simply to predict what a villain might do next, but to understand why they became who they are in the first place. This is part of why his relationships with certain villains, particularly the Joker, feel less like simple hero versus villain conflicts and more like complicated,
almost tragic character studies. Batman doesn't just catch these men and women, he understands them, sometimes better than they understand themselves. One of the most fascinating aspects of Batman's mind is his obsession with preparation, particularly his contingency plans against nearly everyone he knows, including his closest allies. In several major comic storylines, it's revealed that Batman has developed specific, detailed strategies for neutralizing every member of the Justice League should any of them ever be corrupted, mind-controlled, or turned against humanity. This includes plans against Superman, Wonder Woman, and even his closest friends. While this trait has occasionally caused deep rifts between Batman and his allies once discovered, it also reveals something quietly important about how his mind works. Batman doesn't plan for the world he hopes exists. He plans for the world exactly as it is, unpredictable, dangerous, and capable of turning even the noblest heroes into threats under the wrong circumstances. It isn't paranoia in the traditional sense. It's simply the logical extension of a boy who once believed the world was safe, right up until the moment it proved otherwise in Crime Alley. Batman's memory is often portrayed as near photographic, allowing him to recall minute details from case files read years earlier, cross-referencing patterns across seemingly unrelated crimes that most investigators would never connect. Combined with his extensive study of chemistry and toxicology, this allows him to often identify a villain's specific method, a signature poison, a particular explosive compound, a preferred caliber of weapon, sometimes before Gotham's own police forensics team completes their analysis. Language is another quiet strength woven throughout his character. Across various comics and adaptations, Batman is shown fluent in multiple languages, sometimes including Mandarin, Arabic, French, and various regional dialects. A skill developed during his years training and traveling internationally before he ever returned to Gotham as a costumed vigilante. This isn't simply an impressive detail for its own sake. It's practical. Gotham, like any major city, is home to countless communities. And a detective who can only interview witnesses in English would be a detective missing half of his city's secrets. His scientific knowledge extends well beyond simple forensics. Batman is frequently portrayed possessing expertise in fields ranging from robotics to biochemistry to computer science, sometimes rivaling dedicated specialists in Gotham's own scientific community, including occasionally outperforming Lucius Fox's own research team on specific technical problems, despite Fox being one of the most brilliant scientific minds in the entire DC universe. Perhaps the most defining trait of Batman's mind, though, isn't any single skill, but rather his relentless preparation and patience. Where many heroes react to danger as it arrives, Batman is almost always shown anticipating it long before it happens, studying patterns in Gotham's criminal underworld, tracking supply chains for illegal weapons, monitoring known associates of released convicts, quietly building a mental map of the city's dangers long before those dangers ever fully surface. This is part of why so many stories emphasize Batman's exhaustive files on every major criminal in Gotham, sometimes literally labeled and organized within the Batcave's extensive archive system. Each folder filled with psychological profiles, known weaknesses, preferred methods, and even personal history, allowing Batman to walk into nearly any confrontation already understanding, on some level, exactly who he's dealing with. There's something quietly sad, if you sit with it long enough, about a man who has to know his enemies this intimately in order to protect the city he loves. Bruce Wayne doesn't simply memorize crime statistics, he memorizes trauma. Two-Face's descent following his disfigurement, the Joker's endless reinvention of his own uncertain past, Mr. Freeze's desperate love for a dying wife. Batman's mind isn't simply a weapon against crime. In many ways, it's a museum of Gotham's collective pain, carefully catalogued so that no piece of it catches him by surprise.
This deep, almost obsessive understanding of psychology also shapes his strategic approach to actual combat. Batman is rarely shown relying purely on strength, and for good reason. He possesses none of the enhanced physical abilities many of his allies do. Instead, his fighting style, often associated in modern adaptations with a blend of various real-world martial arts, prioritizes efficiency, misdirection, and the use of environment, shadows, rooftops, narrow alleys, turning Gotham itself into an extension of his own strategic mind. It's a beautiful, slightly melancholic idea when you really think about it in the quiet hours of the night. A man with no superpowers at all, deciding very deliberately that his mind alone would need to be sharp enough to face gods, monsters, and madmen, simply because giving up was never something Bruce Wayne ever seriously considered, not since that night in the rain. But even a mind this vast cannot carry Gotham alone. And so, slowly, over decades, Bruce Wayne allowed a small number of people into that world with him. A family, in every sense but blood, built from orphans, allies, and quiet acts of trust. Let's meet them now. If Batman's mind is the engine of Gotham's protection, then the Bat family is its heart. A small, carefully chosen group of people who, over decades of stories, transformed a lone vigilante into something closer to a quiet, unconventional household. At the very center of that family, long before any sidekick or partner, stands Alfred Pennyworth. Alfred first appeared in the comics in 1943, originally introduced as a slightly bumbling, overweight comic relief character, quite different from the sharp, composed figure most fans know today. Within just a few years, however, writers slimmed him down, sharpened his wit, and transformed him into something far more essential. Not simply a butler, but a surrogate father, confidant, field medic, and, in many stories, the only person capable of speaking honestly to Bruce Wayne without fear of consequence. Alfred's backstory has varied across different adaptations. In several versions, he's portrayed as a former British intelligence operative or military medic, explaining his unusual combat awareness, tactical knowledge, and calm efficiency during emergencies. In other tellings, he's simply a deeply devoted household servant who taught himself these skills purely out of necessity, refusing to let the young boy he'd sworn to protect ever face his war alone. Alfred is the one who stitches Bruce's wounds after brutal nights on Gotham's rooftops. He's the one who quietly disapproves, again and again, of the danger Bruce continually places himself in, yet never once abandons him because of it. In many of the most emotionally powerful Batman stories, it's not the villains who deliver the most devastating lines. It's Alfred, gently reminding Bruce that somewhere beneath the armor, he's still just a grieving little boy trying to protect a city that can never fully repay him. The first member of the Bat family to formally join Batman in the field was Dick Grayson, introduced in 1940 as Robin, the Boy Wonder. Dick's origin closely mirrors Bruce's own. The son of circus acrobats known as the Flying Graysons, he watched helplessly as his parents fell to their deaths during a performance sabotaged by a criminal extorting the circus for protection money. Bruce, recognizing his own trauma reflected in the boy's eyes, took Dick in, eventually training him and allowing him to become his partner in the field. Robin's introduction changed the entire tone of Batman comics at the time, brightening stories that had grown increasingly dark and violent in the character's earliest years. It also gave Batman something he'd never had before, a partner who understood his pain intimately, without either of them needing to explain it aloud. Dick Grayson would eventually outgrow the Robin identity entirely, becoming Nightwing, an independent hero based primarily in the neighboring city of Bloodhaven. This transition, unfolding gradually across many years of comics, represented something quietly profound. Bruce Wayne's ward growing up, stepping fully out of his mentor's shadow, while still remaining close enough to return whenever Gotham, or Bruce himself, truly needed him. The second Robin, Jason Todd, introduced in the early 1980s, brought a very different energy to the role. Rougher, more impulsive, shaped by a much harder upbringing on Gotham streets before Bruce took him in. Jason's story took an extraordinarily dark turn in 1988 during a storyline called A Death in the Family, in which DC Comics made the unprecedented decision to let readers vote via a paid telephone poll on whether Jason Todd would live or die following a brutal confrontation with the Joker. The vote was close, but ultimately, readers chose death. Jason Todd was beaten severely with a crowbar by the Joker and left in a warehouse rigged with explosives, dying in the resulting blast, while Batman, delayed just minutes too late, could do nothing but hold his broken body afterward. It remains one of the most devastating moments in Batman's entire history, not because it was unprecedented for a hero to lose someone close to them, but because of how it happened. Real readers, dialing real phone numbers, decided the fate of a fictional child and chose the ending that would haunt Batman for decades to come. Jason's death became a permanent wound in Bruce's psyche, referenced again and again across countless future stories, a physical reminder, often literally, in the form of Jason's old Robin costume, preserved and displayed in the Batcave, of the one time his careful preparation wasn't enough to save someone he loved. Years later, in a controversial and much debated storyline, Jason Todd was resurrected, eventually returning as a darker, more violent anti-hero known as Red Hood, someone willing to kill criminals in ways Batman never could. Their relationship since then has remained deeply complicated, not quite enemies, not quite family, forever shaped by a death that should have been permanent and, in the strange logic of superhero comics, ultimately wasn't. The third Robin, Tim Drake, introduced in 1989, offered a notably different origin from his predecessors. Rather than being taken in out of tragedy, Tim actually deduced Batman and Robin's secret identities entirely on his own, simply by studying photographs and news footage closely enough to recognize physical similarities and behavioral patterns. He essentially talked his way into becoming Robin, believing, correctly as it turned out, that Batman, still grieving Jason's death, desperately needed a partner again, whether he consciously realized it or not. Tim would go on to be considered by many longtime readers as the most naturally gifted detective among all the Robins, eventually adopting the identity of Red Robin as he, too, grew beyond the role. Stephanie Brown, introduced originally as Spoiler before briefly taking on both the Robin and later Batgirl identities herself, added yet another layer to the family's complexity. A character whose journey has been unusually turbulent even by Batman standards, including a controversial storyline in which her death was later revealed to have been staged, allowing her eventual return to continuity years afterward. And then there is Damian Wayne, Bruce's biological son, introduced formally into ongoing continuity in 2006, the result of an earlier, complicated relationship between Bruce and Talia al Ghul, daughter of the villain Ra's al Ghul. Raised for years within the League of Assassins before ever meeting his father, Damian arrived in Gotham already trained as a lethal killer, arrogant, cold, and deeply resistant to Bruce's insistence on non-lethal methods. Damian's journey across subsequent stories, slowly softening, slowly learning empathy, slowly becoming someone capable of real friendship despite his upbringing, has become one of modern Batman comics' most compelling long-term character arcs, showing, perhaps more clearly than any other Robin story, just how much Bruce's guidance and quiet patience can transform even someone raised specifically to feel nothing at all. Beyond the Robins, Barbara Gordon remains one of the most significant figures in the entire Bat family. Introduced originally as Batgirl in the 1960s, partly to diversify the character lineup for the campy television series of that era, Barbara quickly grew into something far more substantial in the comics. Brilliant, independent, and eventually revealed to be the daughter of Commissioner James Gordon himself. In 1988's The Killing Joke, a controversial and deeply disturbing storyline, the Joker shot Barbara Gordon through the spine, paralyzing her, in an act specifically designed to torment her father psychologically. For years afterward, rather than removing the character or reducing her role, writers transformed Barbara into Oracle, a master hacker and information broker operating from a hidden clock tower, coordinating missions for the entire Bat family and eventually the wider superhero community through her unmatched technical skills. Oracle became, for many readers, one of the most meaningful disability representations in mainstream superhero comics, portraying Barbara not as diminished by her paralysis, but as arguably more essential to the team than ever before. Her intelligence and resourcefulness proving just as powerful a weapon as any physical ability she'd lost. Later storylines would eventually restore her ability to walk and return her to the Batgirl identity, though Oracle remains, for many longtime fans, one of the character's most beloved and important eras. Cassandra Cain, another Batgirl, brought a wholly unique origin to the family. Raised from infancy by her assassin father purely to read and predict human movement through body language, deliberately prevented from ever learning to speak or read in order to sharpen this singular skill to an almost supernatural degree. The result was a character capable of predicting an opponent's next move before they themselves fully committed to it, making her, in many stories, one of the most formidable hand-to-hand combatants in the entire Bat family, despite struggling deeply with basic verbal communication for much of her early appearances. Beyond the costumed members, two figures without masks remain absolutely central to Batman's world. Lucius Fox, introduced in the comics in 1979 and given much greater prominence in later films, serves as Wayne Enterprises' brilliant, deeply loyal chief executive, quietly aware of Bruce's double life and personally responsible for developing much of Batman's advanced technology through the company's Applied Sciences division. And Commissioner James Gordon, present since Batman's very first comic appearance in 1939, remains perhaps the single most important ally in the character's entire history. A rare figure of genuine, uncorrupted integrity within Gotham's notoriously corrupt police department, willing to work alongside a vigilante he technically should be arresting, purely because he recognizes that Gotham, in its darkest moments, needs exactly that kind of uncomfortable, unofficial partnership to survive. It's easy, listening to all of this in the quiet hours of the night, to forget that Batman began his story utterly alone in that Batcave, convinced that solitude was simply the price of his mission. And yet, here they all are. A butler who became a father, a circus boy who became a brother, a commissioner's daughter who became one of the
sharpest minds in the city, an assassin's son learning slowly how to love, and a police commissioner willing to shine a light into the sky and trust whoever answered it. Somewhere in that quiet, sprawling family lies the truest answer to who Batman really is. Not simply a man in a cave, but a wounded person who, against every instinct telling him to stay alone, slowly let an entire family of equally wounded people in beside him. And every single one of them calls the same city home. A city we should probably spend some time getting to know properly now. Let's walk together through Gotham's streets. Gotham City has never simply been a setting. Across 80 years of comics, films, and animation, it has slowly become something closer to a living, breathing character. Moody, corrupt, beautiful, and deeply, permanently haunted. Its architecture alone tells a story. Gotham is often depicted blending Gothic cathedral spires, crumbling Art Deco skyscrapers, and grim industrial factories, all layered atop one another, as though the city itself never fully finished deciding what era it belonged to. Some artists and directors have compared its visual identity to a version of New York City that never stopped being haunted by the early 20th century, its gargoyles and shadows permanently soaked in fog regardless of the actual weather. The city's history, as told across various comics, describes Gotham being founded centuries earlier by Dutch settlers, its name and early identity sometimes tied to old, unsettling folklore. Stories of witch trials, hidden underground tunnels, and forgotten districts sealed off after long-buried tragedies. Some versions even suggest Gotham was, quite literally, built atop older structures and tunnels from previous centuries, meaning that beneath its modern streets lies an entire hidden layer of forgotten history, perfect, narratively, for a hero who spends his life moving unseen beneath the surface of everything. Crime Alley, sometimes formally referred to in the comics as Park Row, remains the emotional center of Gotham's geography. The exact location of Thomas and Martha Wayne's murder, later renamed and remembered by the city precisely because of what happened there. In several stories, the district around Crime Alley becomes symbolic of Gotham's broader struggle, a once respectable neighborhood fallen into poverty and crime, standing as a permanent, physical reminder of everything Batman has dedicated his life to fixing, and everything he has never quite been able to. Wayne Manor itself sits outside the city proper, atop a hill overlooking Gotham from a careful, deliberate distance, close enough to remain part of the city's story, far enough to offer the isolation and secrecy the Batcave requires beneath it. Various depictions describe the manor as having been built generations earlier by Bruce's ancestors, its architecture often described as a blend of Gothic revival and older European influences, filled with portraits of Wayne family members stretching back well over a century. Wayne Tower, meanwhile, represents the family's presence within the city itself, a towering modern skyscraper serving as Wayne Enterprises' corporate headquarters, its upper floors sometimes housing Lucius Fox's Applied Sciences division, quietly funding and developing much of Batman's advanced equipment under the guise of ordinary corporate research and development. Arkham Asylum remains perhaps the single most iconic location in all of Gotham, beyond the Batcave itself. A psychiatric institution for the criminally insane, first introduced in the comics in 1974, its Gothic, imposing architecture and deeply troubled history quickly making it a defining symbol of the city's relationship with madness and crime. Arkham's own founder, Amadeus Arkham, has an origin as dark as any inmate the asylum would eventually house. In several versions of his story, Arkham established the institution following his mother's death, hoping to treat mental illness with genuine compassion, only to slowly descend into madness himself after his own family suffered further tragedy at the hands of a patient. This unsettling detail, that the very man who built Gotham's asylum eventually became consumed by the same darkness he hoped to treat, has become a recurring, almost poetic theme throughout Arkham's fictional history. Nearly every major Batman villain has, at some point, been housed within Arkham's walls, and its notoriously frequent security failures have become something of a dark running joke among longtime fans. A facility supposedly designed to contain Gotham's most dangerous criminals, yet somehow responsible for an almost comedic number of mass breakouts across decades of stories. Blackgate Penitentiary serves as Gotham's other major detention facility, typically reserved for more conventional criminals rather than the costumed, psychologically disturbed inmates of Arkham. The contrast between the two institutions, one treating madness, one simply containing crime, reflects Gotham's broader, uneasy relationship with justice itself, forever caught between punishment and genuine attempts at rehabilitation. Gotham's rooftops deserve their own quiet mention here, since so much of Batman's world unfolds upon them. Described across various adaptations as a dense, interconnected landscape of gargoyles, water towers, fire escapes and narrow gaps between buildings, the rooftops effectively form Batman's own private highway system above the city, allowing him to move across Gotham largely unseen by anyone below. The docks and harbour district add another distinct layer to Gotham's geography. Foggy, industrial, lined with old shipping containers and abandoned warehouses that frequently serve as settings for smuggling operations, criminal meetings, and dramatic confrontations throughout Batman's history. The persistent fog rolling in from Gotham's harbour has become almost as visually iconic as the bat signal itself, lending nearly every rooftop scene its distinct, moody atmosphere. Beneath the streets entirely lies an extensive network of tunnels, sewers, and abandoned subway lines, sometimes connecting directly to portions of the Batcave system itself. These underground passages frequently appear throughout Batman's stories as hidden pathways for both heroes and villains alike, reinforcing the sense that Gotham is a city built in layers, a visible, everyday world above, and an entire hidden second city existing quietly beneath it. Gotham's own mythology extends beyond simple geography into local legend and folklore woven throughout various comics. Old urban myths about the city's earliest founders, ghost stories tied to specific abandoned buildings, and recurring hints that Gotham itself may possess some deeper, almost supernatural connection to darkness, corruption, and fear. As though the city doesn't simply produce criminals and madness by coincidence, but somehow actively attracts it. Some stories lean into this idea quite literally, suggesting Gotham sits atop unusually dark or cursed ground, or that its very geography and history make it uniquely susceptible to producing exactly the kind of chaos Batman has spent his life fighting. Whether meant literally or simply as atmospheric flavor, this idea reinforces something quietly important about the character's mission. Batman isn't simply fighting individual criminals. In many tellings, he's fighting Gotham itself, an entire city seemingly determined, generation after generation, to fall back into darkness the moment anyone stops watching. It's a strange, heavy kind of love, if you think about it in the quiet hours of the night. Loving a city enough to spend your entire life fighting against its very nature. But that quiet, stubborn devotion is precisely why Batman never leaves, no matter how many times Gotham gives him every reason to. And it's precisely this dark, complicated city that has produced the strangest, most memorable collection of villains in all of fiction. Let's walk now into Gotham's rogues gallery, one shadowed figure at a time. Every great hero is defined, in part, by the shadows they stand against. And few heroes in fiction have accumulated a rogues gallery as rich, tragic, and endlessly fascinating as Batman's. Let's begin, as most stories eventually do, with the Joker. The Joker first appeared in Batman issue 1 back in 1940, and very nearly didn't survive that debut at all. Editors originally intended for the character to be killed off after his very first appearance, worried a recurring, unpredictable villain like this might become difficult to sustain across future issues. A late editorial decision reversed course, adding a small twist in the story that allowed the Joker to survive, and comics history quietly changed forever because of it. The character's own origin has always remained deliberately unclear, a choice that's become one of his most defining traits rather than a narrative weakness. Various stories have suggested he was once a failed comedian, a chemical plant worker, a small-time criminal, or simply a man who, as he himself often puts it, remembers his past differently depending on the day, because sometimes it's easier to have multiple pasts than one that actually hurts. The most commonly referenced origin describes a desperate, struggling comedian turned reluctant criminal, involved in a robbery gone wrong at a chemical plant, ultimately falling into a vat of chemical waste while fleeing Batman himself. He emerged with bleached white skin, green hair, and a permanent, disfiguring grin, and, more importantly, a mind that had fully, irreversibly broken from whatever remained of his former self. The Joker's core philosophy across most interpretations centers on chaos and meaninglessness, a belief that life itself is simply one cruel, absurd joke, and that the only rational response to a universe without order is complete, gleeful anarchy. This is precisely why he and Batman have become such perfect narrative opposites. Batman represents order built from personal tragedy. The Joker represents chaos born from the same kind of tragedy, having simply chosen an entirely different response to a broken world. Their relationship has been described by writers again and again as a dark, twisted mirror. Two men shaped by devastating loss, one channeling that pain into obsessive control, the other into complete surrender to disorder. Some stories go further, suggesting the Joker deliberately avoids killing Batman, not out of inability, but because their endless conflict has become the only thing giving his own chaotic existence any real structure or meaning. The Joker's voice and portrayal have varied enormously across decades. A campy, comedic prankster throughout much of the 1960s program, a genuinely disturbing homicidal genius in Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, a chaotic terrorist mastermind in Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, memorably brought to life by Heath Ledger in a performance that earned a posthumous Academy Award, and later, a grounded, tragic portrayal of societal breakdown in Todd Phillips' 2019 film simply titled Joker. Harley Quinn, one of the Joker's most significant creations, didn't actually originate in the comics at all. She was created for Batman, the animated series in 1992, intended originally as a minor, one-episode character. Audiences responded so strongly to her chaotic, tragic charisma that she was quickly folded into the main comic continuity, eventually becoming one of DC's most popular characters in her own right. Her story evolving over decades from the Joker's abused accomplice into an independent anti-hero capable of standing entirely on her own. Let's move now to Two-Face, formerly Harvey Dent, once Gotham's own district attorney and one of Batman's closest allies in the fight against organized crime. Harvey's transformation began during a courtroom trial against crime boss Sal Maroni, when Maroni threw acid across half of Harvey's face, permanently scarring him both physically and psychologically. What makes Two-Face particularly tragic among Batman's villains is the specific nature of his psychological break. Harvey doesn't simply become evil. He becomes fundamentally divided, his decisions now often determined by the flip of a single, scarred silver dollar, heads for good, tails for cruelty. A coin that, notably, once had two identical, unscarred sides before his transformation, mirroring his own lost sense of moral certainty. Some of the most powerful Two-Face stories focus less on his crimes and more on the quiet tragedy of watching someone Batman deeply respected fracture into two competing halves of himself, forever unable to fully choose between them. The Riddler, first introduced in 1948, built his entire criminal identity around an obsessive, almost compulsive need for intellectual validation, unable to commit crimes, without leaving behind elaborate riddles and clues, driven by a deep psychological need to prove himself smarter than everyone around him, including Batman. Various stories have suggested this compulsion stems from childhood experiences involving cheating, humiliation, or a desperate need for recognition never received during his early life. The Penguin, born Oswald Cobblepot, presents a different kind of villain entirely. Less a costumed showman, more a shrewd, calculating crime lord operating through Gotham's underworld using wealth, blackmail, and carefully maintained political connections rather than elaborate gimmicks. Frequently bullied for his unusual appearance during childhood, Oswald built his criminal empire specifically around commanding the respect and fear he felt denied growing up. Often operating his criminal network through a seemingly respectable nightclub called the Iceberg Lounge, blurring the line between Gotham's criminal underworld and its high society far more than almost any other villain. Catwoman, introduced in 1940 alongside the Joker, occupies a uniquely complicated position within Batman's rogues gallery. Sometimes villain, sometimes ally, and across many stories, Bruce Wayne's most significant romantic relationship. Selina Kyle's origin has varied considerably across decades, sometimes portrayed as a former sex worker turned cat burglar, sometimes as a skilled acrobat and thief driven by a personal moral code that, while criminal, often aligns closely with Batman's own sense of justice. Their relationship, built on mutual respect, genuine attraction, and an ongoing philosophical disagreement about right and wrong, remains one of the most enduring romantic dynamics in all of superhero fiction. Bane, introduced considerably later in 1993, was specifically created to be a villain capable of defeating Batman through pure physical force, rather than trickery or psychology. Raised from birth within a brutal prison on the fictional island of Santa Prisca, forced to serve his own father's life sentence due to local law, Bane grew up surrounded entirely by violence, eventually escaping after years of survival and self-education. His most famous storyline, Nightfall, saw him breaking Batman's back over his knee after deliberately exhausting him through a relentless string of released Arkham inmates, forcing Bruce to fight every major villain in succession before Bane himself ever appeared. This dramatic moment became so iconic, it was later adapted as the central conflict of Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight Rises. Scarecrow, born Jonathan Crane, built his entire villainous identity around fear itself. A former psychology professor obsessed since childhood, following his own severe bullying, with understanding and eventually weaponizing terror. His signature fear toxin, typically delivered through gas or direct contact, forces victims to hallucinate their deepest, most personal fears, transforming ordinary encounters with Scarecrow into deeply psychological, nightmare-driven sequences unlike almost any other villain's crimes. Mr. Freeze, born Victor Freeze, remains one of the most consistently tragic figures in Batman's entire rogues gallery. A brilliant cryogenic scientist, Victor's wife Nora fell terminally ill, leading him to place her in cryogenic suspension while desperately searching for a cure. An accident during this process left his own body permanently unable to survive outside sub-zero temperatures, forcing him into a specialized refrigerated suit for the rest of his life. Nearly every Mr. Freeze story, regardless of medium, centers not on greed or chaos, but on a grieving husband's desperate, increasingly criminal attempts to save the one person he loves, making him one of the only Batman villains many readers find themselves quietly rooting for, despite his crimes. Poison Ivy, born Pamela Isley, began as a brilliant botanist whose research into plant toxins led to a transformative accident granting her control over plant life alongside various toxin-based abilities. Her motivations frequently center around environmental protection, taken to violent, extreme conclusions. Believing humanity's destruction of the natural world justifies increasingly drastic, sometimes lethal, methods of retaliation. Her complicated friendship with Harley Quinn has become one of the most beloved relationships in modern Batman media, offering a rare moment of genuine warmth within Gotham's otherwise bleak rogues gallery. Ra's al Ghul, introduced in 1971, brought an entirely new scale to Batman's rogues gallery, an immortal eco-terrorist, centuries old, kept alive through mysterious regenerative pools called Lazarus Pits. Ra's leads the League of Assassins, an ancient organization dedicated to periodically cleansing civilization through catastrophic, large-scale destruction whenever he judges humanity to have grown too corrupt to save itself. His complicated relationship with Batman extends beyond simple villainy. He has, at various points across the comics, genuinely respected Bruce, even hoping his own daughter, Talia, might convince Bruce to become his eventual successor, leading the League himself. Clayface, in his most common comic iteration, Basil Carlo, began as a failed actor whose exposure to experimental chemicals transformed his body into living, shape-shifting clay, granting him the ability to mimic the appearance and voice of virtually anyone. His story frequently explores themes of lost identity and a desperate, tragic search for purpose after literally losing his own physical form entirely. Killer Croc, born Waylon Jones, suffers from a severe genetic condition giving him a reptilian, crocodile-like appearance, leading to a lifetime of dehumanizing treatment that gradually pushed him toward violence and crime. Frequently portrayed dwelling within Gotham's sewer systems, Croc represents one of the more physically intimidating members of Batman's rogues gallery, his story often exploring themes of isolation and the cruelty inflicted on those whose appearance alone marks them as monstrous before they've ever done anything to deserve it. Mad Hatter, born Jervis Tetch, channels an obsessive fixation on Alice in Wonderland into his criminal identity, frequently using advanced mind control technology hidden within his signature hats to manipulate victims into compliance. His stories often explore deeply uncomfortable themes surrounding obsession and control, making him one of the more psychologically unsettling villains within Gotham's rogues gallery, despite his outwardly whimsical appearance. Man-Bat, Dr. Kirk Langstrom, represents a fascinating scientific mirror to Batman himself, a brilliant scientist who, attempting to develop echolocation-based technology to assist the hearing impaired, accidentally transformed himself into a massive, bat-like creature. Unlike most villains on this list, Man-Bat's crimes are rarely driven by malice, but rather the tragic, uncontrollable consequences of his own scientific ambition, making him one of the more sympathetic, almost accidental villains Batman regularly encounters. What ties nearly all of these figures together, if you step back far enough, is a quiet, consistent theme running through Gotham's entire rogues gallery. Trauma, transformed into either chaos or obsession, mirrored endlessly against Batman's own trauma, transformed instead into discipline and control. Every villain in this city seems to be answering the exact same question Bruce Wayne once asked himself in a candlelit room as a child. What do you do with unbearable pain? And arriving, again and again, at a very different answer than he did. Perhaps that's the quiet, unspoken heart of Batman's entire rogues gallery. Gotham doesn't simply produce monsters, it produces broken people, and then waits to see which direction their brokenness takes them. Let's step back now, gently, from the weight of all that darkness, and drift instead into something a little lighter. The rare, obscure, and delightfully strange corners of Batman's history that most fans never fully explore. Every great mythology has its forgotten corners, strange little pockets of history tucked away behind the more famous stories. Batman, having existed continuously since 1939, has accumulated no shortage of these quiet oddities. In the earliest Golden Age comics, Batman occasionally carried and used a firearm, a detail almost unthinkable by modern standards given how central his no-killing code eventually became. Editorial decisions gradually phased this out over just a couple of years, partly in response to growing concerns about violence in comics aimed at younger readers. Batman's famous no-kill rule wasn't actually present from the very beginning. His earliest appearances show him willing to use lethal force, occasionally allowing criminals to fall to their deaths without much hesitation. The code softened gradually across the early 1940s, eventually solidifying into the absolute moral principle most fans recognize today. a rule so central to the character that stories violating it, even temporarily, tend to spark enormous debate among longtime readers. There have been several officially licensed but ultimately cancelled or heavily altered Batman projects over the decades. Tim Burton reportedly considered radically different directions for sequels beyond what was eventually released. Various planned Batman films throughout the 1990s and 2000s were scripted, cast, and sometimes even entered pre-production before being scrapped entirely, existing today only as fascinating footnotes documented by film historians and dedicated fans. Batman's costume has appeared in a surprising number of alternate designs across specific comic storylines. During a period when Bruce Wayne was believed dead, Dick Grayson took over the Batman identity while wearing a substantially redesigned suit. Elseworlds stories, a line of comics explicitly separate from mainstream continuity, have placed Batman in wildly different settings entirely, including Victorian-era Gotham, a version of the character as a vampire, and even a Wild West interpretation, each accompanied by dramatically different costume designs suited to their alternate time periods. Some of Batman's rarer gadgets, appearing only briefly across specific storylines, include shark repellent spray, memorably referenced in the 1966 Batman film starring Adam West, and various specialized bat-prefixed tools that became something of an affectionate running joke among fans over the decades. Bat computer, bat cuffs, bat rope, and endless similar variations, all following the same simple, slightly playful naming convention established in those earlier, campier eras. Batman's publishing history includes several fascinating milestones. Detective Comics has been published continuously since 1937, making it, alongside Action Comics, one of the longest continuously running comic series in American publishing history, surviving numerous industry downturns, paper shortages during World War II, and dramatic shifts in public interest across more than 8 decades. The Comics Code Authority, established in 1954, largely in response to public concerns about violent and disturbing content in comics, significantly softened Batman's stories for well over a decade afterward, contributing directly to the lighter, campier tone that eventually influenced the famous 1966 television series. It wasn't until the early 1970s, particularly through writer Dennis O'Neill's work, that Batman began returning to his darker, more detective-driven roots. Speaking of that television series, the 1966 Batman program starring Adam West, despite its campy reputation among some modern fans, was an enormous cultural phenomenon at the time, airing twice weekly and drawing massive audiences eager to see its exaggerated fight scenes, complete with on-screen comic-style sound effect graphics like "pow" and "bam" appearing directly on screen during action sequences, a stylistic choice that remains instantly recognizable even to people who've never watched a single full episode. Batman, the animated series, debuting in 1992, took the opposite approach entirely, embracing a moody, film noir visual style unlike almost anything else on children's television at the time. Its creators developed a technique nicknamed Dark Deco, combining Art Deco architectural styles with heavy shadows and muted color palettes, achieved partly through an unusual production choice of painting backgrounds on black paper instead of white, deepening the shadows throughout every single frame. Many longtime fans, and even several comic writers, consider this series among the most definitive interpretations of Batman ever produced in any medium. Tim Burton's 1989 Batman film marked a massive turning point for the character's mainstream reputation, deliberately steering away from the campy tone of the 1960s series towards something gothic, brooding, and visually striking. Michael Keaton's casting was famously controversial at the time, with fans concerned a comedic actor couldn't convincingly portray Batman, concerns that mostly dissolved once the film's brooding, melancholic tone was fully revealed to audiences. Christopher Nolan's trilogy, released between 2005 and 2012, grounded Batman even further in psychological and physical realism, removing nearly all supernatural or overtly fantastical elements from Gotham's world. Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker in The Dark Knight, released in 2008, remains one of the most critically acclaimed performances in the character's entire history, earning a posthumous Academy Award following Ledger's tragic passing just months before the film's release. Batman's video game history includes several particularly beloved achievements, most notably the Batman Arkham series, beginning with Arkham Asylum in 2009, widely credited among critics and players alike for redefining what superhero video games could achieve, offering a genuinely immersive detective and combat experience rather than a simple licensed tie-in product, elevating expectations for superhero games across the entire industry going forward. Batman's presence extends far beyond the United States as well. The character has been translated and adapted into dozens of languages worldwide, occasionally inspiring region-specific comic adaptations and even entirely unofficial, unlicensed interpretations in certain countries decades ago, before international copyright enforcement became as strict as it is today. In Turkey, for example, unofficial Batman comics were published for years without any formal licensing agreement, creating a strange, largely forgotten branch of Batman media existing entirely outside official canon. Numerous hidden Easter eggs and quiet references have been tucked throughout decades of Batman films, comics, and games. Subtle nods to previous actors, artists, or storylines embedded specifically for longtime fans to discover. Christopher Nolan's films, for instance, contain multiple small references to earlier decades of Batman comics, and even brief nods to previous film interpretations, rewarding attentive, long-time viewers without ever distracting casual audiences unfamiliar with the character's deeper history. Perhaps one of the most quietly amazing facts about Batman's entire history is simply how much he's changed while somehow still remaining exactly himself. He's been a campy, colourful crime fighter cracking jokes on television. He's been a gothic, brooding creature of the night in film. He's been a grounded, realistic vigilante fighting terrorism disguised as theatrical crime. He's been an animated, film noir detective solving cases in a beautifully shadowed Gotham. And through every single version, across more than 8 decades, the same core idea has remained constant. A boy who lost everything in an alley one rainy night, deciding, again and again, in every timeline and medium, that no other child should ever have to feel what he felt. That, perhaps, is the real reason Batman has endured this long, quietly outlasting trends, generations, and entire eras of pop culture that came and went around him. He was never really about the gadgets, though they're wonderful. He was never really about the villains, though they're endlessly fascinating. He was never really about the Batmobile, or the cave, or the cowl. He was always, from that very first 6-page story back in 1939, about grief transformed into purpose, about discipline built from pain, about a promise made in candlelight that somehow, across 85 years and countless writers, artists, actors, and directors, never once stopped being kept. Somewhere out there tonight, in whatever version of Gotham exists in your own imagination, it's still raining gently over the rooftops. The bat signal is still glowing faintly against the clouds, waiting patiently for whoever needs it. And somewhere beneath an old manor, in a quiet cave carved by a river that stopped flowing centuries ago, an old computer hums softly in the dark. Its screen's the only light in the room. Bruce Wayne is probably still down there, even now. Case files open on the desk in front of him. A cup of tea, long gone cold, forgotten beside his hand. Alfred, somewhere upstairs, quietly turning off the last of the lights, the way he has for decades, trusting that whatever needs to be done tonight will get done, the way it always has. Gotham's story never really ends. It just goes quiet for a while. Pauses between chapters, the way all good stories do, waiting patiently for someone to open the archive again, on another night, just like this one. So for now, let the rain keep falling gently outside your own window. Let the cave grow quiet. Let the bat signal dim softly into the clouds, its work finished, at least for tonight. Sleep well. Gotham will still be here when you wake up. And so, quite gently, will he.